Hello everyone, and welcome to another one of my thoughts videos. And this one I'm going to be looking at, with the help of these, genetics and what I think currently about genetics. Some time ago I did a video on tomatoes, how they don't ripen in the shops. I grew one and did a video on it and pointed that out, that it's got half the nutrients and it just doesn't ripen. Well, I did take seeds from it, and this plant here, which has 32 tomatoes on it, is a direct descendant of that video and tomato. And look, it shows the supposed genetic information there is causing them to not mature, and they're staying green. They've been on this vine here for 3 months and they don't ripen. Now, this topic has been around my entire lifetime, and yours too, obviously, therefore, I expect. And it's one of those topics that, like many of the other ones I've been talking about, I'm starting to see errors, inconsistencies, incompatibilities, and just I'm questioning it, and I'm not convinced. Now, here I have a thing that has sparked my thoughts right at the moment. This is a tomato, and it's a fully grown tomato, and they won't ever ripen, I don't think. Now, that's to do with genetics, but it helps to point out where genetics isn't really right, in my opinion. So let's have a little bit of a look at it. Now, more and more on YouTube, when I go searching for things about genetics, I'm starting to stumble across videos with titles like "Genetics Do Not Define Us." And in the end, I finally agree. I don't think that genetics do define us like they say so. And I find it rather difficult to accept many of their claims. Now, when I first started wondering about it, when my parents started doing genealogy stuff and looking back, and they applied to one of these genetics outfits to say what the genetics would tell us, and I thought to myself, well, how do they do that? You've got thousands of ancestors. How can they do that just by percentaging genes when it didn't correlate with what I knew or had been taught in biology and since then of how the genetics and how the genes and the genome works? Then I also kept an eye on the study of the mapping of the genome, the human genome, and there was a project called the Human Genome Project, where they took 2 human beings and they mapped supposedly spent millions, billions of dollars supposedly mapping the gene sequence of the human genome. But this goes exactly 180 degrees contrary to the idea that we are all individual, and that every single individual has their own set or their own sequence of genetics or genes in their genome. So on one hand they're saying we're all the same, and others are saying we're all different, so which of the two is it? Because if we're all the same, you can't use genetics in a court case, for example, to find a perpetrator based on their blood, their genetics. But then if you go for that model and say we're all individual, then the Human Genome Project was a waste of money, because you cannot map everybody's, because we've got 7 billion different sets of genetics. So I think, well, there's an inconsistency totally contrary to themselves in the same study or area of study. Then I started to wonder about the transplants. I came across what they said were chimeras, people who have 2 sets or more of genetics, because they tried doing genetic proof of parenthood of some people when they knew 100% that they were the parents, and the genetics said they weren't. So they looked up their genetics more closely and found, oh my goodness, you've got 2 different sets. And they said, well, that's problematic. How does that work? How can you function with 2 different sets of chromosomes and genes in your body. And then I also started to think, well, hang on a minute, how is it if you get a transplant, I get a new kidney, for example, how is it that if I've got entirely different genetic material than the donor, how can my body then communicate and work with this donated organ if it is an entirely different set of genetics? And there was sort of science fiction-y type movie plots hatched to say, well, what happens if you get a transplant like a lung transplant, for example, and then little by little the genetics of that lung can then start taking over you. You can get memories and all sorts of things from the other person, and you can then start morphing into this other person because of the genetics that you've now got. Now those background things of inconsistencies in their study, contradictions in their studies, illogic in their studies, made me think, well, it doesn't seem to me like the genetics defines us as much as they say. But then, hang on, the real father of this was a monk who bred peas, and some are white, some are black, some are green, and he got them to mix and show that the recessive and dominant genes dictated in percentages of what the likely mathematical outcome of the genetic generations following it was. And I thought, well, that's a spanner in the spokes. If that is true, then what's all this other stuff waffling around about and contradicting itself about? Then I found out recently, I think it was last year, that this monk, he spent years hybridizing the peas to get the white ones and the black ones and the green ones, and so the mathematical calculations that he did were rigged. They are not true in nature. The true basic colour of those peas, once they go several generations down, and what he started with were multicoloured peas. So the basic proofs of the pea experiments were actually not true. They were engineered, and good on the guy for having a try, and he found out lots of information and things, but it does not say that the genetics we have define us. Then recently on those videos that I've been watching on genetics don't define us were geneticists from way back in the 70s who are now older than me even, and they are also saying that genetics do not define us, because thank you to the quarantining that we were subjected to and the study that followed that as a result of it, I found out and learnt a lot more about the genome and how it works, how it's proofread, how it's, what the reverse transcriptase and all those sorts of terminology and stuff to get a clear understanding of how it works. And what these early fathers of the genetics are saying is that the genetic code that we have in our cells are only, it's like a humongously large library of 10 stories tall, and you have to look for information, and there's books on recipes on making this protein, this process and that process. But they surprisingly were saying that there are no instructions written into this thing that they can find. They can find the start of a word and the end of it, and they very cleverly say that they can insert and cut and splice and things, which I don't fully believe, because of looking at the techniques of how they do it. A lot of it is a lot of guesswork, suspect, cooking the books, correcting errors that may not be errors or are errors already, and it's just shambolic, really. And in the end, I said, with all the quarantining, it's absolutely not trustworthy. But the common concept is that with the replication of the DNA, it splits apart in segments, and how it figures that out is the question, and takes copies and then closes back up again and takes a photocopy, if you like, of a book or a segment of the genetic material. Now, in the end, therefore, to summarize it, the genetic the genome of so many billion nucleotides long is really just a humongous big library. It's a reference library. It may have instructional books in it or whatever, but it's a reference library. Now, if you can get the concept, the difference between a library and the user of the library, you're getting into the right ballpark, I think. That there is a higher intelligence, if you like, or a higher thing, a force or whatever, that decides what part of the library it's going to use, when, how, where. It is an intelligent thing outside of the genome. The genome is a hardware library, but there is a higher intelligence or a higher being or whatever that uses it, who accesses it. Now, the experiments they did with artificial exosomes in the jabs that they subjected most of the population to, and incidentally, I think the statistics are between 20 and 40% of the world's population has been dispatched from the planet as a result of that, just to let you know. And then they showed that they could manufacture some hardware, but our software, intellect, or whatever, our spirit, our being that uses this hardware was, in most of us, was able to discern that this was just junk and ditch it, demolish it, get rid of it, bin it. And so that's where the area of genetics, where they're hoping to make genetic medicines and therapies, they're going down the wrong path, because our intelligent being is way more intelligent than the hardware that they are trying to manufacture. For 20 to 40% of the population, their being was tricked into using the hardware to their demise. The other 60 to 80% of the population figured out that it was junk and demolished it. So I am basically not believing that their claims that they can do what they say they're going to be doing with the genetics. It really does not define us. Now, you talk about, well, how come I got blue eyes and my wife's got brown and my children didn't get blue eyes, this and that. So, well, they say statistically my children can only have blue eyes in the next generation, and it's only a 1 in 4 chance because of the mathematics of those P studies. But when it comes down to it, it is the choice of the intelligent being that inhabits the body and uses the hardware that chooses what that color of the eyes is going to be. There may be a few factors that help it decide really quickly and well, and others where it just arbitrarily decides. They are admitting that with cancers and things, they say that they identify some genome, but it can be switched on and off. And that also supports the idea that it is only hardware, a library, a reference library, that the being may choose or not choose to read and act on. So when you look at so what is actually happening, I'll try and keep on track here, with the tomatoes. They've hybridized them, which, in other words, they've done what the P guy did with the tomatoes. I believe that the plants actually have an intelligence which is outside of the hardware. There is a being there, very minimally basic, but it's there, that has some sort of decision-making and learning ability. They've now found out that trees, plants, fungi, bacteria all communicate and cooperate with each other. There is a definite intelligence there which is outside the biology of just the cause and effect, which is a grave mistake to think that everything is just cause and effect. There's something above the cause and effect that uses causes and effects to achieve what it wants to achieve. I believe that in the hybridization, the hybridizers in India, and two places is India where they grow a lot of the seed, and in Israel where they do a lot of the genetic selecting of the tomatoes. There's lots of places around the planet, those are two that I know of. They pay the Indians a pittance to grow the seed, and sell it for, I think they paid them $11 a kilo in India to grow it, and sell it for $2,500 or something dollars in Europe per kilo. So it's a big racket. What they're doing is teaching, by selecting those particular traits, they're teaching the intelligent being of the tomato plant to use certain portions of their library to create the certain specific things. Now, when you get it grown in one area, it will be taught to grow a certain way. It will get taught to be resistant to certain fungi, how to communicate with the fungi and the bacteria that it learns to interact with. When you take that seed to another context, like here in South America from Europe or India, they have learnt how to deal with stuff that's somewhere else, and they arrive here and you find, oh, lo and behold, it doesn't know how to deal with pests, how to communicate and dialogue with fungi that are here, the innocent bugs and bacteria, and so now you get pestilences, which is great because now they can sell you herbicides and pesticides. Now, in the case of the tomato, and this is what I'm learning from this tomato downstairs in the patio, is that that learning, evidence of that learning. They have taught the plants to not mature. The tomato plant actually comes from South America, as far as I can remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, and they usually live up to 4 years. They grow laterals and then more laterals after they fruit, more laterals, and they keep going for 4 years because the climate doesn't kill them off. But where most of the population is living is in Asia, Europe, and the further from South America, and therefore subject to the seasons. So the places that they're growing the tomatoes, they have to get a crop, the plant to grow and crop in 1 year before they get frosted. So they have taught by selecting and conditioning the genetics or the intelligent being behind all this to fruit in 1 year. Now, those will do okay, and they'll apply pesticides and insecticides and all sorts of things to keep these things from their unknown, interactions with other organisms. And so when you get the seeds come down here to Colombia and South America and grow them up, they're going to, I find that they get a mold on them very quickly, and you've got to spray for them, this and that and the other. But I consider that the relationship between the mold and the tomato plant is actually a good and symbiotic system. In the natural, the plant will get benefits from fungi in the soil. They will transact, they will swap nutrients and all sorts of things and communicate with bugs, bacteria, fungi and other plants. And at some stage, they know that they're going to die off. They're going to need to get rid of some of their leaves, the old ones that have now got toxins and all sorts of things in that they need to get rid of. And the fungi is going to do them a favour by consuming them. So the plant gives the fungi permission to attack it and consume it. But because it hasn't been taught what the time frames and what kinds of fungi and things, it hasn't learnt how to deal with the ones that are here. And so I have found that the ones in here, there are certain ones that will get consumed by fungi before they fruit. Others that have fruited and got fungi and sort of limped through, and the next generation, which is this generation, third or fourth generation I think, that went very long time well till it fruited, as you saw, very nicely, and then it let the fungi eat it, leaving the fruit. But in its relearning of what this area is about and what is here, what bugs and fungi and bacteria and things it has to negotiate and learn to live with, then it has gone back a step in the hybridization reverse of unlearning how to not mature because now it's trying to figure out, well, what is my timeline of life? And it's finding that it's longer than 1 year, but it hasn't figured out that it's 4 years yet. I did have one that went for 2 years, and quite successfully. I think maybe the one before this. And this one's is then learning that, oh, well, I live for a year, I let the fungus eat me, I fruit, but it hasn't learnt now that, oh, I have to actually mature them as well. So the next generation after this one will be interesting to see whether it will grow. I've got some growing from plants already, to see whether it can learn to regress and learn how to deal with the fungi that is here, how to negotiate with it, how to benefit from it, how to do that interaction, stay alive for the length of time before it sacrifices its leaves and gives a crop that will mature and therefore will have increased nutrients and all the rest of it. So I think that this is an example of learning where the plants interact. It's not, they will tell us that a fungal attack or a pestilence attack, bugs or whatever, is just, oh, the world is bad, here, take some pesticide and fungicide. It's not. They don't know how to cope. If a plant is healthy, it knows how to deal with the insects. It knows how to ward them off and tell the insects, I'm not for eating, go attack one that is ready to be consumed, that is weak, that needs to be consumed. I'm not it, go away. And same with fungi. Yes, you're here to eat me eventually, and I will, but in the meantime, you give me some nutrients and things, but then in the end, at the moment, I'm still healthy, so stay away, please. And they can negotiate like that, and at the appropriate time say, yep, I've done my dash, produced my fruit and everything, now you can have me, and on to the next generation. So in a roundup, I do not think that genetics defines us. It's just a library of information of how to make proteins and things. It is a higher being that accesses the library to be able to use it in an intelligent way. The tomato is an example, and I believe all of the plants are able, and humans and animals are able to learn to cope with their situation. So therefore, as a practical outworking of that, I would recommend going back to growing the vegetables and fruit and vegetables locally, and not importing them from elsewhere unless you know that they are deficient and not going to survive and everything. You need to teach your local plants how to survive within your local environment with the local fungi, the local bugs, the local bacteria, everything local, so that you have a better and more sustainable production for your economy locally. I think it's a big mistake to be growing things elsewhere, transporting them halfway around the planet because of all what I've just said. So there we are, tomatoes. If with the next generation of tomatoes, we'll see what happens to the plants and the fruit.